Hey, friends. So we're still in lockdown right now. You can see I got the COVID hair going. We changed sides of the table because this background is way more interesting than what we had going on the last time we talked. If you recall, that was chapter one of the rewrite of the first Lake of Dragons book, which has a new title, To Kill the Dragon. I'm going to keep reading this. Hopefully, it's helping you get through the lockdown, social distancing. It's a good idea. Um, Quick update before I get started. So I'm working on book three in the Lake of Dragons series. I'm not going to tell you the title, and if I already did, I forgot. But I'm not going to tell you what it's called. But I am about just shy of 30,000 words into the rough draft of the third Lake of Dragons book. There's going to be five total, and then there's probably going to be like three books and a prequel kind of deal. But in any event, today we're talking about To Kill the Dragon, Lake of Dragons, book one. If you want to be all technical, it's To Kill the Dragon being the first part of Lake of Dragons. And we're on chapter two right now. The journey begins. So let's jump right into it. When Milek finally woke, the sun was at its highest point. His skin was good and warm from being cooked under it until midday. He took a deep stretch and looked out across the horizon. Long, rolling fields reached out for miles before him, dotted here and there with small groups of trees and settlements. He slowly rose to his feet, turning to look back toward the hut where he had spent his life up to that point. Perhaps he would never see it again. From his vantage point, however, all he could make out was the tall oak crowning Keller's Hill. In his mind, he said a brief goodbye and watched a stream of memories dance through his head. He would miss his hill, his tree, and yes, even bathing in Yester's pond, which at this point was on the other side of the hill. All at once he realized he was alone. Imatath had gone. The packs were gone. Rumala, Imatath's horse, was gone, and all of the food was gone. The hair on the back of his neck stood as a chill shot quickly through his body. He'd never been alone before. Worse than that for him right at that moment was the fact Imatath had abandoned him. After everything he'd been through the night before and everything that had happened between he and Imatath, his thoughts trailed off, and he fell to his knees, lamenting his situation. Why would Imatath leave me, he thought. He seemed so proud and I fought so strong. Why would he be leaving me? He continued torturing himself for just a short time before gathering himself back up. He took one last look at his only friend, the oak, and one last scowl at the pile of carcasses still smoldering before heading north. The night before, Imatath was leading them in the direction toward the river. The great kingdom of the north had always been a favorite topic of Imatath's. He spoke of it incessantly. Perhaps he had left to return there. It lay far beyond the river. According to Imatath's stories, if Milek kept the rising sun over his right shoulder and the setting sun over his left, he should eventually find himself within that great city. There was no way to be certain Imatath indeed traveled to the great city, which was such an object of his fancy, but it was all Milek had to go on. It was as good a chance as any. With the sun just passing overhead, he did his best to quiet his mind and focused on the trail. As he trod along, his mind proved unable to remain quiet for very long. He tried to reason why Imatath would leave him. After a while, he decided it wasn't anything he'd done wrong. Imatath had been acting quite strange the night before and spoke of someone else having the task of telling Milek the remaining mysteries of his past. Perhaps this was another test. Perhaps their little party the night before was the end of a chapter in his life, and saying goodbye was too much for his mentor's heart to bear. Milek held on to that last one as it was his hope. Whatever the future might hold for him, he wished to stand tall in Imatath's eyes and linger long in his heart. Imatath was the only father he'd ever known, the only father he'd ever had, according to him. He pulled out his sword and slowly went through some of the techniques he had learned throughout his lifetime of training as he walked along. It occurred to him this was the first day he could remember not training. Aside from Callum's day, the last day of the week was set aside to pay respects to Callum for his generosity and all that we have. There was no training, no work, and no food on Callum's day. Only worship, praise, and teachings of Callum's word. He thought of asking for Callum's help, but didn't have the energy to come up with the words just then. Anyway, he didn't want to think about Callum or the book. He really wanted to be training, going through his sword exercises with Imatath. He wondered if he'd ever get to do that again. As he walked along, he came upon a small wooded area off to his right. It wasn't quite a forest, but it would provide a bit of shelter for him to rest for a while. It was a good time to take a break and maybe snack on some berries. A few yards into the woods, he found a nice tree to sit under right next to a blackberry bush. Though not much of a meal, it was perhaps the best he would do that day. The spot he had chosen would also provide a bit of shelter from the wind, which had picked up while he was walking. It would have to do. The berries were quite tasty, but definitely not enough to fill him. Due to his late start, the sun was already low in the sky and he was getting hungry. On top of that, he felt as if he might be experiencing what Imhotep referred to as a hangover from all the ale he had drunk the night before. He would need some meat and another good night's rest if he were to successfully complete the journey he had no choice but to take. He'd need both. Physically and mentally prepared. The state he was in just then was a far cry from that. Imhotep had left Milek's bow and quiver behind, and under his tutelage, Milek had become quite the hunter. Dinner, unlike the rest of his life at that point, would not be a problem. He found a good spot under a tall pine sitting atop a small ridge. A narrow brook curved back and forth through the valley below. Judging from the abundance of trail, it was quite a popular watering hole. He readied an arrow and sat completely still. The only sound was that of leaves dancing on the wind high up in the trees. Barely half an hour passed before a good-sized Falin strode up to the brook to drink. Falin were swift, graceful, and strong, but not difficult to take down if your mark was true. He slowly raised his bow, drew back, took a deep breath, and fired an arrow. His mark was true. His arrow whistled through the air and slipped in between two of the Falin's ribs, piercing the animal's heart. With a grunt, it fell where it stood. It wasn't long before the beast had been quartered, cooked, and Milek had fed. After the meal and his emotionally taxing day, he decided this would be a grand place to make camp. He gathered branches, built himself a fire, and then built a small shelter under the protection of a fallen tree. His belly full, he was ready to sleep and attack tomorrow with a clear head. Sleep came easy. There were no dreams to disturb his slumber. He slept like the dead. After a good night's rest, Milek woke with the sun. Big, fat, glistening droplets of dew still dangled from every blade of grass, and the fog had yet to burn off from down in the valley. He felt physically refreshed, ready to attack the road before him. With a clear head, he was ready to start the rest of his life. He packed up his bow, as much Falin as he could eat before it would spoil, water, and some berries. He started off north again toward the river and the great kingdom promised in Imhotep's stories. He was sure this great kingdom had a proper name, but for him it was only the great kingdom of the north. That was the only way Imhotep had ever spoken of it. The river, he hadn't a name for either, would be about 2 days' journey on foot. However, as good as he felt physically, the morning run seemed a great idea. Perhaps that's why Imhotep had him run every morning. Preparation. That's what Imhotep had said his life had been up to that point. He started off at a fast jog and didn't stop until midday. He ate what was left of the Falin and moved along. He slowed a bit after his meal, but he still made pretty good time considering he was on foot. By midday the following day, he was approaching the edge of a small village resting along the bank of a mighty river. He had hoped to restock his supplies there. Unfortunately, the place seemed quite deserted. He slowed his pace and drew his sword. At the same time the day before, he could faintly see the smoke from the villagers' cooking fires drifting up into the sky. Now it was empty. At midday, the streets should be bustling with people hurrying home to their feast. There was nary a sound. Uneasiness swept over him as he neared the main gate of the small village. It was too quiet. There should have been something. A child playing or a man coming home late for the feast. Something. Anything. There was nothing. The entire town appeared asleep. Warily he continued. As he approached the first hut within the main gate, he noticed the door had been smashed in. He slowly strode inside. The stench of rotting flesh hung in the air. It seized him immediately when he entered and tugged his attention until he quickly surveyed the room. One body, the body of a man of relatively large stature, lay sprawled out across a table occupying the center of the room. A large chunk was missing out of the poor bloke's neck. The wound was rather dry and the corpse's skin quite pale, as if the body had been drained of all its blood. Amatelazo, he thought. A woman's body lay curled around that of a small child in the corner. Her head lay a few feet from the rest of her. Her face grabbed his attention. It was frozen in a look of terror like none he'd ever seen in his short life. He looked back to her body, still clinging to her baby's lifeless carcass. He considered their embrace for a moment, frozen in death. She died trying to protect her own. Perhaps she could have escaped as her husband was being drained of his life's blood, but she didn't. Instead, she gave of herself in a desperate attempt to save her child. It was a completely selfless action. How strong must the love of a mother be? His thoughts drifted to his conversation with Mettille about his own mother. He learned early on she died shortly after he was born. He didn't have any details about her demise, but he knew he spent no time with her. He wondered if she had ever held him the way this courageous woman lying in front of him clung to her child. Did she ever cradle him in her arms, brush his hair back, and sing to him? Mettille said she had a song sweeter than a chorus of songbirds. Had he ever heard that song? If he had, he would never be able to recollect, as he would have been but a babe. A strange emptiness began in his belly, as if there were a hole right through his midsection. His head swam as dizziness swept through it, and he thought he might lose his feet. He stumbled out of the hut and fell to the ground in a heap. If only there were someone to embrace him, someone to tell him everything was going to be all right. His eyes burned as they filled up, but he fought back the tears. He struggled back to his feet. Feeling sorry for yourself won't do any good, he thought. He pushed back against the hopeless, empty feeling threatening to consume him and forced himself to move on. He went back into the hut, ignored the carcasses, and gathered all the supplies he could carry. He ate what was to be the meal of the slaughtered family he was sharing the hut with, and then moved on to the other huts in the village. Apparently, in Mettille did not have a taste for horses or other livestock, as there were a good number of them scattered about the town. He took the sturdiest horse as his new steed. He named him Validus. Validus was packed and ready to ride when Mettille heard noises coming from a hut down by the river's edge. It was a hut he had yet to check. It almost sounded like a cry for help, but muffled and without the voice. Get a little drink here. Got a little excited with that. Excuse me. He approached the hut slowly, cautiously. Over the past few days, he'd seen some things he'd never seen before and had no idea what to expect. What kind of beast or monster could be lurking behind that door? He slowly pushed it open and was immediately met by the vicious bark of a very unhappy scrod. His sword instinctively slipped out of its scabbard, but the scrod did not advance. It stood its ground, brazen and unafraid. Mettille had no desire to unnecessarily spill any blood, even if it was just a scrod. He pulled his sword back and offered his other hand. "It's okay, laddie," he said in a soothing voice. "Relax, just relax." Then he heard a whisper, barely audible. It came from under a pile of rubble in the corner behind the scrod. The pile began to shift and a small shape crawled out. It was a little girl of about 5 or 6 summers. Bright blue eyes peered out of a grubby face behind dirty golden hair. She spoke again. "Please don't hurt John." She could barely squeak the words out. Apparently she'd done some screaming during the attack that had fallen upon this village. "John? Who's John?" Mettille asked. "They be meaning you no harm." The little girl moved in front of the scrod as if to protect him. She stood as tall as she could make herself. "Is this John?" he asked, trying hard to sweeten up his voice. She nodded her reply as John's bark became a low growl. Mettille lowered himself to one knee and held out his hand. The scrod warily crept from behind the little girl, who was still trying to stand tall and protect him. He continued his low growl as he gingerly approached Mettille's outstretched hand. Then he scrutinized it with his nose. Apparently Mettille's hand had a pleasing odor as John's tail quickly began to wag. Before long, his head was nuzzled into Mettille's chest. Mettille pet John and received some sloppy, wet, affectionate kisses for his trouble. The little girl seemed to relax a little as well when she saw Mettille had yet to slay her scrod. After a time she spoke again, at least as much as she could without a voice. She told Mettille her name was Perrin, and her village was attacked during the evening feeding by these monsters with long claws and sharp teeth. She said her papa went outside when he heard the screams and never came back. She told him the monsters came in her hut, and her mama had run at them with her cooking blade. She said one of the monsters popped her mama's head off like a dandelion. When John came running in from the yard barking, the monsters started howling and squealing like they were hurt or scared. She hid under the table screaming, and John never left the spot he was in when Mettille had arrived. They talked for quite a while before Perrin started dozing as she spoke. Mettille laid her down on a cot in the corner and let her sleep. Then he and John went outside to start a fire. He burned up all the carcasses in the village. The stench of rotting flesh was already strong in the air, and it wasn't a healthy odor. John didn't leave his side as he went through hut by hut, cleaning up. By the time he was finished, he was quite weary, and the afternoon had fled away. He prepared a meal for Perrin and him, and planned to spend an evening there in the village before getting back to his journey. He also gave some thought to his new dilemma, Perrin. She was a lass of, by his best estimation, about 5 summers. She would slow him down. On top of that, he was relatively certain she wouldn't want to leave John behind. That would slow him down even more. Perrin he could prop up on a horse and tow along with a rope. John would be traveling under his own power. Scrod would be setting the pace. Malik looked down at the animal and said, "You'll be slowing us down, Scrod." John replied by jumping up, placing a paw on each of Malik's shoulders and licking his face. He couldn't help but laugh as the two fell to the ground, wrestling and playing. John's unbridled affection was, besides being wet and slobbery, very therapeutic for Malik. The past few days had been quite grim, and playing with John gave him a few moments of peace, gave him a chance to forget the calamity his life had become of late. The two boys played for a bit, and then Malik got back to his meal preparation. As he finished up, he looked down at John, who sat obediently at his feet. He decided having him on the journey would be worth the time they would lose because of him. When the meal was ready, Malik roused Perrin from her slumber, and they ate. You could tell her head wasn't quite straight after the horror she had witnessed the night before. How terrible it must have been for her to watch her mother be slain by some beast. He himself felt such a great loss, just knowing he had a mother, but she was gone. He couldn't imagine watching her die, especially in such violent fashion. Perrin wasn't crying, whimpering, or even whining. She sat quiet, staring off into nothingness. Malik wondered how far away from the small hut her mind was just then. He let her be as they ate in silence, two children who had just had their lives ripped apart and of no fault of their own. He found himself staring off into the nothing just as she was. After the meal, Malik decided to break the silence. "So, Perrin, I be on a journey right now. Will you be joining me?" "Where you be going?" she asked without breaking her stare. "I be headed to the great kingdom of the north," he replied. She held her stare. "Sure, I'll come. Your papa took me to that place once. It's far the safe way." "The safe way?" he asked. "Aye, the safe way." She appeared in a trance. "What be the safe way?" he pressed on. She finally broke her stare and looked him in the eyes. "The safe way be the road what leads down the river and around the Sabin forest. That way be at least twice as far as the other way, but it's safe." Malik had never heard of the Sabin forest. He knew there was a great forest beyond the river, but it never had a name for him. "What be the other way?" "Papa say the other way be too Dane. She couldn't say the word. Too scary." "Too dangerous," Malik helped. "Aye, that be the word Papa used. He say they be calling it the Sabin forest because them trees be always crying for the men what die there. There be terrible things, monsters and evil men who be hiding there, waiting for travelers. All them trees moaning be to warn the people not to come in. I've heard them trees moaning at night. Papa say that be how trees cry. Did you ever hear them cry?" She finished with a quizzical look. No, I ain't. But I be thinking we should be going that way if it be saving us that much time. Besides, we be having John with us, and he be watching over us." Malik replied with as much confidence in his voice as he could muster. Truthfully, he was a bit concerned, as he had no idea what to expect out of the forest. His desire to complete the journey was far greater than any of his fears. He also felt a bit of confidence knowing the Amatalaza were afraid of John. The Scrod was sturdy. He should prove quite helpful in a battle. Perrin just nodded. She was very confused. Too confused to even be afraid of going through the sobbing forest. The next day she would be starting a journey through a place her father had taught her to be terrified of, and she would be going with a complete stranger. The thought didn't trouble her in the least bit. There were far too many other demons torturing her mind just then. Before her journey was done, there'd be more. Malik talked a bit more about where they would be going. Most of it was lost on Perrin. Her mind was elsewhere. She lay down for the night, and Malik found some more horse sacks. He filled them with what he guessed would be enough supplies to get them through their journey. When he had first packed up Validus, he had only been packing for one. Now he had 2 more mouths to feed, and his journey would last a few days longer. After he had everything prepared, he turned in as well. Sleep didn't come easy on that night, and his slumber was less than peaceful. As he slept, his head was full of terrors, visions of things to come. Well, that's it for Chapter 2. Stay tuned. I'll be posting Chapter 3 as soon as I get around to it. I think I mentioned this the other day. It's been pretty busy during the lockdown. I've got so much of nothing to do. So, in any event, have a great day, stay safe, and happy reading.